Thank you. I'd like to muddy the water a little bit, especially after two very rational, analytical lectures. Yitzhak Engelhardt, you suggested a very analytical dilemma, comparing Maimonides, Spinoza, and Mendelssohn as three alternative views about the relationship between religion and Judaism and the state, or a Jewish state. But I would like to add another dimension, that beyond philosophy and principles, there is also social reality. And I want to give an example relating to what yesterday was mentioned by Joseph Weiler, the lack of civil marriage in Israel. Now, I'm on the side of the angels, the secular angels. I mean, God forbid, I'm not on the side of the rabbinical. I am for, in a matter of principle, for civil marriage. But the reality of Israel is that there is a gap between the fact that there is no civil marriage and the reality in Israel, which allows and accepts cohabitation, civil unions, and gives people who live, even if they are of the same sex, the same rights in terms of taxation and in terms of social welfare and in terms of pension rights. So in reality, they are equal to people who live in religious matrimony, but this is on a level which perhaps on a psychological level, on a moral level, gives them some status of a second-class citizen, but the reality is that they have the same kind of legal rights enforced both by customs and by the legal system. And this seems to me perhaps one way around the problem of the logical definitions which come out of Maimonides, Spinoza, and Mendelssohn. And in this respect, and I think it was mentioned yesterday also, we are perhaps a little bit like Britain, not current Britain, which is crazy, but, you know, historical Britain. That on one hand, you have the head of state being the head of the state religion. Until recently, bishops and archbishops were ex officio members of the House of Lords and as legislators, but you had a very wide system of equality and religious freedom. So there's a gap between the, if you will, the philosophical element based on principles, which are logical, and perhaps I usually don't quote Yeshayahu Leibovich, but let me quote him on this one. Leibovich once said in Hebrew that Medinat Yisrael is Medina Chilonit HaYedu'a B'tzibur Kedatit. Israel is a secular state living in concubinage with religion. That's not the worst kind of choice, given the dichotomic zero-sum alternatives which come out from principles and from legal systems.
Okay. I agree. I mentioned actually as one possibility of solving the conflict which have been done until now is to maintain symbols which are empty of substance. This, for instance, civil marriage. It's a very good example, which is part of this phenomenon. Officially, we don't have civil marriage, but practically, we have civil marriage. You can conclude marriage in Cyprus, and it will be recognized here, which means, for instance, states which wouldn't recognize civil marriages wouldn't recognize it if they have been done under private international law. This is one of the phenomenons of maintain a symbolic value of a religious precept without the substance for coexistence. Of course, I talking about it, but there is a, as you say, there is a basic problem of maintaining this situation, and we cannot be sure that if the religious orthodoxy will maintain this part of it. I give you an example. let's say that a liberal and a religious person agree that the state should not interfere with acts which do not disturb another person, not damage another person, or not damage the collectivity. We agree. Let's say the religious person says, yes, okay. But then, when they are talking about damaging, there will be a huge difference between the two. Let's take example homosexuality. For a religious Orthodox person, homosexuality will bring a catastrophe on the Jewish people generally, so it will damage. The law says, sources say, if you make homosexuality legal, catastrophe will come to the world, and all of us will be punished until the exile. So there is a problem of the discourse between the two. The secular person says, well, you're talking nonsense. There is no transcendental sanctions of the exile which people, if we recognize it. The religious person says, but we agree that if it's damaging the collectivity, and this, I believe it's damaging the collectivity. Here you have a basic problem of discourse even, between a religious Orthodox person who believes in transcendent sanctions to the collectivity, if you don't prevent. So the problem we have is that, let's say, the symbolic and value of some precepts which lack substance may be attacked in future by extreme orthodoxy. So I know it's part of the status quo that you, let's say, on the Sabbath rest, you had no public transportation, but you had private transportation. It also shows you a principle which is not implemented. But now the problem is again, so I'm not arguing that this is a way of it, but who knows if the orthodoxy goes further, if it will maintain the status quo.
Thank you very much, both of you. I have a question for each. I think that there are many levels, Professor Englert, to your distinction, and on most of them I actually completely agree with you, but I don't see the I don't understand the attempt to show that this is a huge problem, because there is a problem for the religious point of view in saying that Israel is a Jewish state, and the obvious conclusion for me and many other people is to say that the meaning of the Jewish state in all these documents is not the halachic state. And this is very easy, and actually historically is quite obvious. And so the idea that it is a Jewish state in the halachic sense is an invention of some of Israel's and Zionism's enemies. I don't think that many people in the international community debating Israel's independence thought that they were talking about Jewish state as an Islamic state rather than Jewish state versus an Arab state. So what you're saying is not, you are talking about a very interesting problem for the Jewish person. And you are talking for a very interesting problem in the life of Israel because of the relationships between Jewish religious observant people and non-observant. And as you yourself said, this is a very serious problem, but pragmatics of life together require answers that will not even attempt to suggest that there is a problem to the principled. So I'm not sure that the feeling of a problem here is serious. I think that what you are suggesting is very interesting in the sense that for your context, and this is how I'm going to go to many, because in your point of view, the real problem is not for the non-observant or even the reform or the conservative or the traditionalists, because they don't really think about Judaism in the way you think about it, which is the most profound way of thinking about the meaning of a Jewish state halachically. since most of these people, as Spinoza himself understood and as Kelsen understood, I mean, oscillate between realism and relativism, don't really know and don't have coherent points of view about these things, but they do need to solve their problems of life together. They do, and it's not coherent, and it's okay. So I think democracy actually is a very good tool to show that you don't need coherence and high principle to live together in a solid way. Now, the opposite, I think, is true for many. Because what you're saying is that the problem, the real problem of big meaning is primarily the problem of secularists, individualists. Because if you have religion, and to a lesser extent, if you have nationalism, you do that probably because you seek big meaning, which is a basic need of all individuals. I agree. Big meaning makes a huge difference. But I think the answer that both religion and nationalism give to big meaning is some sort of transcendence. Individuals, if they don't have a sense from where they come and where they go to, of some kind of teleology in their life, they are in big trouble. Now, religion does this very well, nationalism less so, but the liberal individualist problem is that he doesn't like both religion and nationalism because of these reasons. And what you offer as a flourishing, liberalism of flourishing, is art. But art doesn't really answer to the need that you identify, which is, as we said, community. Now, civic community, the demos, and international cosmopolitan community, a la Nussbaum, are not enough to provide the big meaning that you require, because they're too thin. They're not sufficiently endorsed in a life together of individuals. So I am afraid that your solution is marvelous, and it's much better for secular people if they can have a high life of culture, and this is great. But it doesn't give them community. Now, communitarians try to do that, but efforts to create communitarianism have not been extremely successful. So I don't know that we have an answer other than nationalism or religious or a combination of them for the need that you identify so well. And maybe this goes back to the claim of the religious that ultimately, if you think deeply enough, you need absolute values. It's not clear that you can only build a community on absolute values, but you need some source of meaning that will make your life transcend your individual and your family and blah, 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 blah. So I'm curious.
Let's get a few questions and then you guys just... it's faster.
Thank you. This is a follow-up to the first question, and I'd like to bring you up from the lofty realms of philosophy to the down-to-earth, to the actual situation. There are several laws, as you know, of course, in this country which discriminate between Jews and Arabs. For example, the law of return, 1950, which means every Jew can come and become a citizen. This is not true of 20% of the population. Their relatives or themselves, family members cannot come here, or whoever cannot come here and become a citizen. Then we have the law of the nation, which was enacted last year, which many Arabs feel is discriminatory. So perhaps the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is an illusion.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I don't really know quite where to begin, because I think that what has given enormous big meaning to over half of humanity is human rights and the perception of the other. It follows on from what the previous speaker said in a kind of a way. The perception of the other, which has been badly neglected within religious tradition and has caused others to be less than full persons in many ways, has been a shift of perception and paradigm in the last century. And the religions are coercive. It would be a lovely view, you know, a religious meeting without coercion, but it doesn't exist. And when we talk about the alternatives, for example, I'm going to give a more concrete example of civil marriage being achieved by pragmatic means around the system in Israel. Civil divorce has not been achieved, and many of those who do not have a religious marriage are then faced by needing a religious divorce. So we haven't solved the problem by avoiding coming to terms with it. Women are discriminated against in all the religions. And one of the big changes, I think, of the 20th century is recognizing women as full persons. And women live within religions and outside religions. And religion has discriminated against women within the religion. And I represented the women of the Wall who wanted a more equal version of Orthodox religious personhood within Judaism. And they did not achieve it either through the state or through the courts or through the religion itself. And of course, as I just said, those who within the religion or outside the religion are hampered by what the previous speaker said, excluding the other within the concept of the state of Israel as having full citizenship, and excluding women from having full personhood, and excluding, of course, LGBTI. So when you talk about meaning, I think that one of the problems is that religions have not adapted to the new and far more inclusive perception of meaning, which includes all persons, and not the patriarchy of the religious personhood.
Okay, let's take one more question and then get some answers and then continue. Yeah, and then...
So I find what Professor Avineri said, and echoed by Professor Englert, really not just a second best solution, a terrible solution. Because one of the great acts of the state, which does not only regulate relations between individuals, but it's a statement about the values of the state, is to say that secular people do not have the right to the symbolic act of a state-recognized marriage. To be a Yidua B'tzibur is not to be married. And to say to a citizen of the state, to get married, you have to go to another state. Imagine if in another state they would say to get kiddushin, you have to leave the state and go to another state. If we applied the same kind of solutions to a discriminatory regime vis-à-vis Jewish people in other states. So it's all very nice, and I fully understand Professor Englert when he said the sense of damage is that the way you described it. But that minimizes the sense of damage to the other, so why should one prevail and not the other if the state is truly to accept the notion of fundamental human rights, equality, etc.? And the other thing that I find unacceptable in that solution is that implicitly it defines Jewishness and the Jewish character of the state of Israel by one faction, a minority faction among the 14 million Jews that live in the world. As if they have, the halachic Jew has a monopoly of defining what it means to be Jewish. Why should the state of Israel give preference to one particular version of what it means to be a Jew? And by that solution that is adopted, pragmatic, why are they complaining? De facto, they have all the rights in pension, etc. But it's not only about the legal rights about pensions, etc. It's about the statement of what kind of state is the state of Israel. And I find that solution minimizes the dignity of those who have to avail themselves of the pragmatic solution and compromises a communitarian, inclusive notions of what it means to be Jewish.
I wasn't speaking. Okay, you. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'm not speaking about the ideal solutions. I'm speaking about coexistence between different outlooks, which means that here I'm going back to the idea of Bohr's idea of complementarity. There is a fact that there is a basic problem between outlooks. And you have one, the orthodoxy has another, and I was explaining what's the difficulty between the two. And one of the solutions, which of course not an ideal solution, because you have to renounce on basic values of both sides, but it enables coexistence. I'm not saying that the ideal. My proposition was that the orthodoxy would have to change and to accept the existence of a modern democratic state, but the basic problem is for the spiritual difficulty for an Orthodox, coming from the Orthodox tradition, to apply this kind of renouncing. So I'm not speaking about an ideal solution for both sides. It's not ideal, neither for the Orthodox nor for the secular one. But you have to care about coexistence, because if the religious minority denies the validity of the Jewish state, it's a great part of the minority which would deny it. We have already a small minority which denies the legitimacy of the Jewish state, which is living here. And I think that's one of the problems of marriage has been mentioned before, that from national cohesion, it's not only a problem for the religious, it's also a problem for the secular circles of identifying the populations who identify with the state. So you have a serious problem that one of the solutions, which I'm not saying it's an ideal one, is that you maintain a symbolic matter, but you empty it from its substance. And this is, first of all, it's not true. We have civil divorce here for mixed... there is... איזה רעיון? It's a good solution. One of them which might be, but I'm saying I was analyzing the problematic, and it's very difficult to find an ideal solution if you have two concepts which are so contradictory at the time, until one will have to change it. Let's say if the Orthodoxy will change and will accept the democratic liberal state as part of the religion. Okay, then you have solved it like the Reform Judaism. For Reform Judaism, the liberal democracy is no problem. But for Orthodoxy, it's a great problem. And the problem is, if you have a great minority of Orthodox people in the state has to care for its cohesion. And that's one of the marriage, the problem of religious marriage was also a national issue. It has been mentioned here. It's not only a religious one, but the state was caring. And one of the solutions was to find an awkward, non-consequential solution, like not recognize it officially, but enabling it substantially. So I'm not saying that's the ideal solution, but it's part of the problematic that you have populations which have completely contrasting values, and I was explaining it, what was the basic problem of orthodoxy, which comes from a completely different background, which I described, from declaring the state of Israel as a deed of the Satan, which hinders redemption. That's the Turikarta and Satmar, and don't have to explain it, until the opposite, completely opposite union, that it's the beginning of messianic redemption. And of course, all these positions have problems with a liberal democracy. And now you come to talking about the Arab. I mentioned the occupied territories constitute a major, I have analyzed it from a religious Orthodox point of view, because according to one of the messianic part of it, who believes that the Muslims, the Arabs, have no right over the territory, and we have to implement the messianic hopes, which means to return to the fully holy land, etc. That's a fact, and the problem is how manage you these things in a state which wants to integrate all these people into society. That's what I was describing as a problem. Of course, it would be much better if, let's say, from a liberal point of view, you abandon the messianic ideas of eschatological interpretation of human history. It would, of course, but there are people who, and a great minority, who believe that the state of Israel is the beginning of redemption. And you have to continue, now we have to continue it by human activities in the territories, etc. So that's a fact. I'm not talking about it should be, maybe to change it, but that's a fact which is part of the problem of what means to be a Jewish state today.
Now it's okay? Ruti, we agree that it's not trivial to say that the way that Richard Rorty, Charles Taylor, or Wallace Stevens say that religion, that art can be a secular substitute for religion. I think that it's an interesting idea and it's promising. Okay, so we agree on that, and I don't think that it's trivial to say that. Now, it's not trivial to say that the liberal state should support the creation and dissemination of art. Prominent liberal thinkers such as John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, Bruce Ackerman, and others, and not to mention the neutralist liberals such as Jonathan Kwong and Andrew Kramer, they all object to states' financing of the art. What they have in mind is a comparison of art to religion. I think they are utterly wrong in that. And they are utterly wrong, I would argue, even in their own terms. That is to say, if you are a liberal, and if you accept it, that art is a major vehicle for the cultivation of the intellectual and moral capabilities of individuals, and if liberalism, that the foundational norm and assumption of liberalism is human reason. So if you are a liberal and you understand that at the basis of everything liberal stands our belief in human reason, and if you accept it, that art is a major instrument for the cultivation of human reason, you must add one to one and accept it, no matter what your liberalism is, that the liberal state should support the creation and dissemination of art.
The argument for art is that it does not support only reason. It's actually a great strength of art vis-a-vis reason.
Did you have the microphone? No, Rudy, here's the microphone.
What I'm telling you is that the greatness of art is not that it supports reason. The greatness of art is that it shows you also the limits of reason. And this is why it's so important as a corrective to a totally rational approach to social and human life. But in any event...
I very much welcome this comment and endorse it very warmly, needless to say. But art is a major instrument for the cultivation of our intellectual and moral capabilities. So the liberals such as Dworkin and the Rawls and many others should support massive support of the art by the state on liberal premises, I would argue. That's the first point. Second point is community. I've not discussed the issue of community. let's put community in context. We live in many communities which are smaller than the national community that we are members of. We have the family, we have friends, we have the Faculty of Law of Tel Aviv University, we have the Israeli Academy of Arts and of the Sciences and the Humanities, which is a community of scholars, etc. So we lead our lives in many, many communities and get our satisfaction, our response to our basic need for communities in various communities. One of them should be the national community, but we should not make the mistake of assuming that this is the only community, or maybe even the most important community. Okay, our families are more important for us than the national community, and sometimes our friends, etc., etc. Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem, of course, right? So community in context means that the state, yes, the state provides us with a community, but it's not the only one, and maybe it's not the most important one. But I don't discount the importance of national culture and national community as a community. Our challenge is to create a combination now between a mild version of nationalism with liberalism. There are many problems why Israeli liberals are against all versions of liberalism. The major reason is the face of Israel's nationalism in the past 5 decades, which is occupation and settlement, etc. It's very difficult, if you're a liberal, to think of combining your liberalism with nationalism if this is the face of nationalism in Israel. But we need to stand to this challenge, I would argue, and work on modifying and correcting our Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and change it, and then create this combination of national community and nationalism and liberalism, even here in Israel. Now, if you support nationalism, this doesn't mean that you need to support settlement and war. Nationalism stands for the cultivation of the heritage of your people, the best creation in poetry and literature and plastic art, etc., etc. So this should be the materials of nationalism for the creation of a sense of national community. Francis, I'm not the one to defend the failures of the current versions of Judaism in Israel. All I would say is Judaism is a huge, needless to say, civilization. We live in an unfortunate era in which our religious fellow citizens pick up from this huge and rich civilization certain materials, which in many ways are awful and terrible materials. And we have to work with them for reinterpreting this huge civilization and what is dormant, currently dormant there, to make it vivid and part of our lives. But I would conclude by saying, no, I'm not blaming only the religious people for picking up from the huge civilization of Judaism all those awful and terrible materials. I would blame us liberals too for not even beginning to think of creating the bridges with our fellow Jewish religious citizens, fellow citizens. So it's our problem too, not only theirs.
Yes, a comment not about Israel now. Religion in the sense of an established, institutionalized church and nationalism historically often went together, and I'm now thinking of France, for instance, where you've got, on the one hand, the Republic, and on the other, the Catholic Church, which resisted the Republic and, at least for a century, was in favor of a return to what there was before the Republic, a monarchy and a nationalist monarchy, unified and not diversified. Of course, there are exceptions. Napoleon, not a great liberal, had different standards, and so he closed, when he could, the University of Cologne, because it was Catholic and traditionalist. So there are different perspectives here, but usually liberalism does not go together with religion or nationalism. And I'm now, again, France, thinking of a splendid discussion between a conservative priest and an intellectual liberal in Anatole France's L'Orme du Mail, not a book that nowadays many people read, but it gives the perspective in a very clear sense. And I think we should keep this in mind in our days as well. It is hard to combine liberalism with either nationalism or institutionalized religion, because the two go together.
My question is for Maudner. My response to you is bring politics back in, because in a way you gave a very thin idea of liberalism that ignores political liberalism as the main creation of us as humans, but also as political humans. And if you look back to all your the tradition that you cited, from Aristotle to Rousseau and Mill, etc., the main idea is that we become humans by doing politics, and our political community is the main. You put religion and nationalism together, but liberalism grew up with nationalism, but not nationalism in the ethnic sense, but in the demos sense. And if you bring back politics into the picture, then the big ideas come from the different ideologies that we try to profess, and from within this plethora of different ways of life which we practice through politics. So, and when you cited the institutions, you talked about the courts as protecting the individuals, but politics, the political scene, is where we do our community, and this is where one person, one vote, and the voices, etc., should be heard. So I think bringing politics back into your picture of liberalism would give it a much thicker perspective. But I think from within these 2 days discussion, our big problem is whether liberalism is at the works of the rules of the game. So liberal democracy is the plethora in which different parties and ideologies, etc., play, or that we say liberalism is just one alternative, and we have religion and nationalism and other collectivist ideas as other options. And if this is the case, then how do we justify the rules of the game? So I think, yesterday there were talk about illiberal democracy, which I think is a contradiction in terms, but if you see liberalism as just one of the players, then how do you construct the playground? And if you see liberalism as part of the rules of the game, what do you do with liberalism as an ideology?
Yeah, let's have 2 more questions.
This is a question to many. I want to question the importance of meaning at all. Ecclesiastes says, who knows, or asks, who knows, does the human spirit ascends upwards and the beast's spirit sinks downwards? Why do we need meaning at all? I mean, it's a self-deception, or it's an illusion. There is no meaning. I mean, we live. We want to live in a comfortable way. That's it. Why do we need to seek meaning?
The title of this conference is The Challenges of Liberal Democracy. And I'm afraid we are evading what is perhaps the greatest challenge of liberal democracy today, certainly in Israel, also elsewhere, which is bringing down the wonderful walls of this wonderful institute, and also to some degree the walls of our academic discourse, and reaching out to people who have no idea in hell what liberal democracy is about. I'll stick with Israel. Let other countries work out their own. Now, the two contributions in this fascinating panel in a way address the issue because they offer two competing notions of meaning, as has been said before, and I agree with the question whether meaning is the main crux of the matter, but suppose it is. And now my issue narrows down to many Mountner for the following reason. If we let this conversation out into the streets of Jerusalem beyond Talbieh, into the streets of Tel Aviv or the small cities, into the streets of the Israeli internet, Facebook, Twitter, there are a few secret agents here, but very few, relatively speaking. A vast number of followers of what is going on here would be either unable to understand much of the lingo, which is legitimate, it's an academic conference and so on, or else stand by the elitism which cheap provocateurs would so easily take up. Now I will say something strange and I'll say it quickly because our time is running out. Whereas Yitzhak's topic, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish participation in the Israeli political sphere, the rabbis, the rabbanut, the legislation, the compromises you have so well sketched to us, is not considered by a majority of Israelis elitist, haughty, or condescending. It is by me, maybe a few other people in this room, a handful of secular liberals. But most of the rabbinic wisdom, the orthodox character of the state of Israel, is not taken by most Israelis, including seculars, to be haughty and condescending. Not so the culture that many is talking about. The aesthetic education, to quote Schiller, who was one of the launchers of this wonderful idea, to beautify and moralize people by an aesthetic, sharing an aesthetic, cultural, artistic sphere. Whose culture? Which aesthetics? Ours? Miri Regev's, or to play it more difficultly, other wonderful cultural options which are not the ones you are talking about and include neither Chekhov nor Schiller. This would sound, unlike the rabbinate, which for me is the condescending one, your solution, when it would sound unbelievably elitist and condescending, even before we start investigating the merits of the moral potential of aesthetic education.
Okay, let's have one more question and then I think Shula.
Well, I have two comments and one question, all very simple. The comments are, one is that, like one of the speakers before me, I also feel that the discussion with the Orthodox always ends up with the secular making concessions to the Orthodox. This is the basic reality of life here. It's not a discussion between equals. This is one sense. The other comment is a historical comment to remind us that nationalism and liberalism came to the world together. And for a long time were really what I used to teach my students, two sides of the same coin, like socialist Zionism, for instance. It was the same kind of ideology looked at from different possibilities. And it has lost that. We have lost it in the second half of the 19th century. During the 20th century, to a great degree, And there is perhaps some possibility, very remote possibility, of putting these things together again, what came to the world together. The question I have is also simple. Yes, art is great, wonderful. How come you're not talking about science? The major expression of human rationality, which goes along with liberalism, is science, first of all. If you want to, and it's inevitable in the sense that perhaps with a little less art we can live, but with a little less science we can't anymore. So I was wondering, I really followed you with great empathy, and I like your argumentation, but somehow I think that perhaps something is missing here.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as I can. Ben, I think Shula Volkov gave you part of the answer now, that these are twins that got born together and that somewhere in the course of the 19th century got separated from each other. On principle, of course, there are contradictions, maybe tensions between liberalism and religion, but they are reconcilable, I think, even on principle. Depends on what kind of liberalism, by the way, not only religion, but what kind of religions of liberalism you bring to the table. And in the lives of many countries, such as the United States and Britain and the Scandinavians with their Lutheran churches and all that, you see that there are tensions, but still liberalism and religion can go together. But I don't think, needless to say, you would not support us wanting to live in a world of dichotomies. It's much more complex than that. Political liberalism, republicanism. You introduce into our discussion the issue of republicanism, and I wholeheartedly support it, but I'm very cautious, and I'm afraid of it, because it makes politics, on the one hand, rich with ideas, important ideas, crucial ideas. On the other hand, it makes politics an arena in which it's a little bit more difficult to come into compromises and all that. So there are many problems with republicanism. If you ask me yes or no, my answer is yes. I support the Republican idea, which is far longer, by the way, than liberalism. It begins with Aristotle. Okay? Liberalism is something fairly new. But I'm in support of republicanism, an introduction of republican notions into our political discussion. I'm in support of it, but it's a little bit dangerous and we have to be very cautious. I would say that republicanism can work well with a particular political culture, which I'm not sure that we have it right now in this country. Okay. You ask why do we need meaning, and you immediately provided us with a not very extensive answer to the issue of meaning. And you said the meaning of life is that you live your life, period. And then you introduced, or before that, the issue of the absurd. Okay? So I won't delve into the issue of the absurd. It would have taken us 2 months to deal with it, and it's not very relevant to our current discussion. But you yourself came with an idea, what's the meaning of life? The meaning of life is basically that it's meaningless, but you live a life. That's one possible answer. But the answer is that as human beings, mutar ha'adam, is that we ask these kind of questions and look for responses to these kind of questions. That's it. Fania, I'm the opposite of an elitist, the exact opposite of an elitist. Because my argument goes as follows. If you guys say that art is important for spiritual elevation, enrichment, intellectual cultivation, and moral cultivation, if you guys say all of that, and you can say that, I support it, why is it that a ticket for the opera in Tel Aviv costs 430 shekels? Assuming that opera is an art, I still deliberate with myself. I'm not quite sure about whether it's an art. But assuming that if you tell me that opera is an art, it should cost 40 shekels a ticket and not 430 shekels for a ticket. So my project is to say yes, very much together with Ruthie and with many others here in this auditorium. Art is important, extremely important. But if it is important, it cannot be the case that it should be confined only to certain classes, which are both educated and well-to-do. Okay? It should be provided to everybody. I read a memoir written by a Scandinavian professor about how was it to live in Scandinavia in the 1930s. And there was almost tears in my eyes. By the way, it reminded me of the years in which I grew up as a teenager in Tel Aviv under the labor, the labor movement. You are a worker, you work for 8 hours a day, you get home, you take a shower, you put a white shirt, and then you go for a lecture, or for a visit in a museum, or for a theater show, etc., etc. That's the kind of regime I would want to live. Yes, a social democratic one. So it's exactly the opposite of elitism. Now we live in an elitist era in which only the affluent and the highly educated can consume art. I want to make art accessible to everybody by providing them both the background condition and make it either free or very cheap. Should I agree with you, science? Science can be another source. Why I have not included it? Because I'm not sure that science can be a response to our need to cultivate our moral capabilities. I was interested in both intellectual and moral capabilities, but I fully agree with you that, science is very inaccessible. You take people to a movie, to theater, maybe even to a plastic art exhibition, it can be fairly accessible. Not so much plastic art, but movies, theater, etc., they can be accessible. Art is basically not that accessible, but we know that there's popular art, and you can make it accessible. Science. So I'm wholeheartedly for that too. We should make science, scientific knowledge accessible to as many people, and you can realize the awe of being a human being in this universe not only by reading poetry, I guess, but by making yourself acquainted with the contribution of science men. Yes, I'm for that.
Okay. We have 5 minutes. Okay.
I am active in a women's group, Mahsom Watch, if you heard about it, and we go to the checkpoints and we write what we see. And really, I was educated in a very frum school, ultra-Orthodox, and I find myself with women who don't know what it is halavi, what it is psari, and just a paradox, with whom I can talk, I can't eat, and with whom I can eat, I can't talk. It's difficult to be a Jew.